we find that when we don't have anything new to announce, like new web packages or plugins or fun stuff like that, we try to fit in some topics that we're hearing a lot about. So today is again one of those best practices sessions, and the reason that I picked this topic is because when we ask for feedback on this webinar series in particular, I've heard quite a few times about how to best do internationalization and localization. It's a big topic. There's a lot of little edge cases and things like that, best practices and that kind of thing. So to fit it into this format in this webinar might be a bit of a challenge, but fortunately it's also pretty easy. So I think if I just show you, the gist of it, then it's easy to do in 20, 25 minutes. So let's get started. As is the tradition with the webinar series, we like to begin with a demo so that if you find that it's not appropriate and you want to tune out, you can, and you don't have to sit through all of my slides just to see a demo. So we'll start with the demo. We're going to show how to do multi-language support, how to do localized formats for dates, times, currencies, numbers. We'll show how to dynamically translate stuff, and we'll show a bit about how you might do runtime customizations, and I'll explain what that means. So let's get to it. I have up here running in our HTML5 client a simple order screen, and I want to show a bit about what it might look like to have this be localized and internationalized. So first of all, you notice that there's fields, labels, buttons, a value list. We see also the value of a calculated field, which is a dynamically derived value. And what I want to show is that if I change my language, say from English to French, you'll notice that immediately the screen is updated. We get all of our labels in French. We get the field labels in French. Down here we see the buttons are also in French. Even the tooltips are coming up as well. Down here, the value list as well is translated, so particular items that I might want to choose can be coming from translations. I'm going to hit my refresh button here because I have to do that to get a couple of the other things that I want to show you. One is that the number format for the freight field is now formatted in that number format for that locale, so that format's been localized. It also changed the currency symbol from dollar to euro. Probably the price you'd want to convert the value to, but that's a whole other topic. But the actual currency symbol that gets used by default is localized. Another thing you might notice here is that the date time format went from month, day, year to day, month, year. The US is kind of an oddball. We like month, day, year. Most of the rest of the world does day, month, year. So that was able to switch as well when I changed, just when I changed my language. It's worth noting that internationalization, or I18N as we call it, it has a couple of components. One is the language. The other one is the country. In this case, I changed my language, but not my country. I'm going to put it back to English and US and show you a little subtlety about when country comes into play versus just changing the language. So you can see that, again, I have my month, day, year format on the date with the 1 p.m. instead of 1300 hours, it's 1 p.m. That's how Americans tend to look at it. Although I could remain in English, I could switch my my country code to Canada. Oops, if I could type Canada, and you'll notice that although the language didn't change anywhere, the format for the order date switched to the Canadian format instead of the US format. So that's another subtlety, and I'll show you sort of how to set that up and how it was done. So that's really the first demo. it's quite simple. It's basically anywhere that you can see text. Oh, I forgot one thing. The calculation here, we saw it changing from French to English. However, a couple of values in there, the order number and the contact name, should remain the same. So if I put this back to French, refresh, you can see that that the calculation changed. However, the order number and the contact name remained the same. So we're doing a bit of dynamic substituted values, like merged in with the I18N message. Also, if I wanted to show a dialogue, you can see that this is formatted and translated in French. And if I go back to English and show this dialogue, you can see that it's in English, but it still has those values in substituted in the larger I18N message. So we'll take a look at how to do, we call that parameterized I18N message, so how we can specify parameters. So let's switch over to the IDE and sort of see how it's done. I have a bunch of stuff open, so let me close all this. Evidence that I work on these things right up until the last minute. The first thing that we want to do is just sort of set up our application for I18N, and that's that you do right on the solution level. So if I highlight my active solution node and I look at the solution properties, you see that I have this I18N data source property. Now, when I came in to first do this, there was no data source selected, so you can't do any I18N stuff until you set your I18N data source. And what that is really a table that sits in any database that you want, and the table name can be whatever you want. You can use an existing table or create a new table. You can see that it's only showing this one table because it's looking for specific columns that it identifies as supporting the I18N data source. The easiest thing to do is just select your server and create a new I18N table. It'll prompt you a bit about what you might want to call it. I usually just leave it blank. If you leave it blank, it names it I18N messages, and that works for me. Once we set that up, now we can go about setting up our keys and our translations. So the next place to do that would be under the resources project. You'll see this I18N files node. If you right-click that, you can bring up the I18N Editor, and this shows you all of your keys and your messages. Right away, you'll notice that there's this filter. If I were to remove that, I get a lot of stuff. So there's already a lot of things that are just built in. Basically, they're built into Servoy and even into Java. So we get those by default. Those can kind of be in the way when you're trying to work with your specific application stuff. So it's always good to use a filter. In this case, I have my I18N examples keys, and it's also good to pick a nice namespace convention. Doesn't matter exactly what you do, but it should be sort of namespaced and consistent. So here you can see that I can drill my way down into the different parts of what I set up for this example. So if I want to look at what a key really is, it's really a name value pair for every language and country combination. So there's the default key with a reference value, and then there's all the translated versions of that. So if I just pick one of these, say choose a language. I have a label somewhere on my form that says choose a language right when I was switching the language. You can see that this is the name of the key. And then there's the reference text, which is just what is shown in the developer. It's also the fallback value. So you don't have to provide a translation for every key that you have. If you don't translate it, it's not like it'll just show the name of the key. It'll show you the reference text. So it's possible to leave things untranslated and sort of clean them up later if you want. After that, you can pick the locale text. You can see that in English, I have it specified as choose a language, but if I go to French, then I have the French version of that. So once you have your key established, you can just go down the line and and keep adding in translations for every language that you want to support. So pretty much that's how you set up the key and the translations. What I tend to do is set up the keys immediately as I need them. So you really want to get them. I think it's easier to manage it if you get them in first, and then you can set up the translations later. Maybe have someone do that, a third party do that. So let's take a look at how we got it into the UI. So down in my solution, I have my I18N demo form. And you can see that although these are rendering the translated value, or really the reference value, if I look at the property for the title text, if I could get this to show, do it down here. So this opens up the text property editor, and you can see that there's the I18N tab here. So it brings up the search screen also for locating your keys. So you can type in your filter. You know, I could go right down to, you know, customer, and you can see that it'll find it. Double click that, and then you click OK, and it inserts it back over here. And so then that specifies that this label will be translated. You saw that we had tooltips on these fields. So if you look at the tooltip text, again, same thing. I just reused one example tooltip for everything. One interesting thing to point out is how we got the formatting to work. So again, anywhere that you can pop open this editor, we can put in I18N keys. So any property of any component that has that text component, we can make it dynamic. But there were some other examples that weren't really just on the UI. For example, the format of the date, for example. You can see that I haven't set the format on the component itself. What I did is I set it on the table. In fact, I set the title property of the data provider as well on the table editor. So let's take a look at the orders table and see how that was set up. So if we were to look at, let's look at customer real quick. You'll notice that I also put the I18N key here as well. And again, I get that text editor, so I just popped it in there. But also you can set up a default format here. So for the order date, I set up a format that is dynamic. Of course, I could have hard coded in here and just put it in, you know, DDMMYYY or something and had it format everywhere, but I want it dynamic. And so if we look at the value for that, I'll just open this again and leave it open. This was the format. You see that I actually switched the value, the formatter, based on the locale. So between French and English, I actually change it. And then even when I get down to English Canadian versus English US, Ukraine, I'm gonna take me forever. There we go. It was different. So you can see that the Canadian overrode the US value. And that's how I was able to get that subtle change. So you can set formats here as well on the table itself, and I did that also for freight. You can see that I set up that currency format, which was formatting the number a little bit differently, the comma versus the decimal as the separator. Let's take a look back at our form and have a look at the value list. So we have this value list here which shows the ship method, and that was also being translated, and that's a bit more complicated than a simple text property. So we actually did that in the value list. So let's take a look at this example value list. Now this is just a custom value list with some display values and some real values, but for the display values I'm plugging in again that I18N key. So you can just plug these right into your value list and it'll switch dynamically. The other example that we showed was the calculation and the dialogue, and both of those get into a bit of working with I18N messages in code versus just in the UI and in the configurations. So let's take a look first at our display order calculation. You can see that the data provider for this element goes to a calculation, and in the code here, all we're doing is getting using the I18N API, and we're getting the translated message. We're also passing in a parameter. Just to show you where to find that, you can get it in code complete. You can just type in I18N, get message, get I18N message, and then you get that. You can also always find that down here in just in the Solution Explorer if you're looking for that and you want to see what's supported. So how this worked was I'm passing in the name of my key, but then that also takes a parameter, 2 parameters, the order ID and the name of the contact, which I'm just pulling right off the record because we're inside a calculation. So what does this I18N message look like that allows it to be parameterized? So if we go back in and we look at, I think it's display order, this one, you can see that in the reference text here, I have, these little parameter placeholders, and you just do the curly braces with the number of the parameter starting at 0, and then when you call that method and you pass in those parameter values, it'll substitute them. So what's nice is that if you want to have a long message to the user, we did the same thing for the dialogue, that you can just pass them in. And if we look at, say, the, let's just turn off the language here, and we look at the French version of that, you can see that it puts French, but it also still has the placeholders. We did the same for the dialogue, so I might get a lot of results for dialogue, so I'll just go back to my examples. If we look at the dialogue one, it's this one. You can see that I actually put in quite a number of parameters, also a bit of HTML to do the line breaks. But it's the same concept. And if we look at the code behind this, when I push the button, again, we get the title is just getting a message without parameters, but the message itself, I specify the key, and then I give an array of these values. And you'll notice that I even formatted them to the current locale. So I'd used, I formatted the currency and the date, but instead of hard coding it, I looked it up. So I got the translated value for the date format. So that's just sort of like a dictionary of different formats for different locales. You could also do the button, of course, too, but I think OK translates in most languages. So one other thing you might have noticed is that I was actually switching the language dynamically on the screen. I was, toggling between French and English here, and you could see the screen just pop when I did that. So let's take a look at what went into that. In the combo box here, I have a value list of languages, and in this one I have countries, and on the data change handler, I'm calling this method to update locale. And really what I'm calling is I18N, again, the runtime API for working with I18N, set locale, and then you pass in a language code and a country code. And these are the 2 character codes, like EN and US, or FR and CA. Those are the 2 country codes, and they're just being pulled right off the value list that are attached to those combo boxes. And so the moment that you call set locale, your translations all switch. So it's pretty convenient. Also here, I'm storing it in a cookie. So the next time I log in, I get the same locale that I had set when I left. Now, actually changing locale at a runtime is not, I would say, not that common in applications. It's nice to do it for the demo here so that, I don't have to switch it on my my browser or my operating system. But typically what happens is when you start a client session, it's detecting the locale, and that's what gets set. So it's not like you have to really do this. It should just work based on your user's locale for their browser or their operating system. But if you did want to give them the opportunity to say, yeah, even though I'm working on a German computer in Germany, I tend to look at this application in English. That's pretty common. So they might want to switch to the English translation. So that's how you could support that, and you could store it in a cookie or user preference like I've done here. Also worth pointing out that the value list that I showed was also coming from, I have this languages value list, but I'm actually populating it dynamically in this method where I'm again calling I18N get languages, which gets all the system languages that are loaded. You may not have translations for all of them, but so you may want to limit that to ones that you do bother to translate. But I was actually using I18N to get the list of languages and countries that are loaded. There's one other thing that I'd like to show in the demo before we, well, there's a couple other things. First, I want to show where the I18N stuff gets stored and how you deal with it at deployment, because I think that's important. So first of all, let's take a look at where they get stored in development. They actually go in right here, I'm in the Workspace Navigator. They go in the resources project that's hooked up to your solution, and you will see once you establish that I18N data source, you get this messages folder, and then you'll get all these text files really that go under there. And there will be one file for every language country combination, plus one file that's like the reference that just has the keys. So that's this one here. And you can see that it's named like server name, table name, dot properties, and then it's server name, table name, language code, dot properties. So this is the reference one, and if I open it with the text editor, you'll see that this is just a simple properties file, name equals value. And here it's really the name of the key, and the value is the reference value, because this is not for translation, this is just to identify the key. If I open up another one of these, you'll see here are all my French translations, and then you'll notice that I have this one, the EN_CA. Remember I showed you how I had a language and a country combination. Opening this with a text editor, you'll see that it just has the overridden values, because I'm going to inherit everything from English, and then I can override what I want specifically when the user's in Canada. And so I just did those two date formats to override, and you'll see that as a separate file. So what's nice about these files is that they're all in your workspace, which means they fall under revision control like everything else. So if you're doing your I18N work right here in the IDE, then it automatically gets put under revision control. Now, it's also worth pointing out that there is a database table. That was the very first thing that we set up, was what that data source was. So where does that come into play to development? And the answer is it doesn't really come into play development too much. In most cases, it's really just pointing out that named connection, so that at deployment, it's going to look for that server and find all of the I18N keys and translations there. But let's take a look at that table. So I put it in example data I18N messages, and you can see that what it creates is primary key, and then the key name, the language, and the value. And if we look at the data, we have everything here. So one thing that's worth pointing out is this is just a regular table. Now everything I've showed you so far was just working through the API and all of the stuff in the IDE, but you could always just build forms, relations, value lists, whatever you want against this table. It's a real legitimate runtime table. So an example of what I did here is I added a tenant ID. It's way over here on the right for some reason. I added a tenant ID. So for example, I could have multi-tenant translation. So even if people were looking at something in the same language, they could have different names for something depending on which company they belong to, or even a user preference. So you could do whatever you want with this table. It just has to have those 4 key columns in it. Now, if I was going to deploy this, I would have to bring my I18N keys and translations along with me. So I'll just sort of walk through the wizard real quick. And if I was exporting the solution, I'll do a file export because I can show you the import options. You can see that export I18N data is just a simple option. So that'll bring all of the messages with me. And if I check this one, it'll, the next 2 screens, I think it'll prompt me for the import options. So when I'm importing the application, I can specify that I want to import the I18N data. I could also specify that I only want to do new keys. So if it finds an existing key, it won't update it. Even if I've changed it, it'll just do new inserts only. And that's for situations where maybe you provide translations, but then you also let your users do customizations. So if they've customized something, then maybe you don't want to override it. But if you added a new key, say a new label on a new form, you do want to import that when you do that. So what happens when the solution imports either a traditional import or a war deployment? It takes all of those exported messages and it populates that table that I just showed you, so that at runtime the application knows where to find the messages, because there is none of those text files anymore. That's just a development time thing. Okay, we're getting close to our time limit. The one other thing that I just wanted to show you in the demo was this other tab here, and just to show you that I built a form with a grid that points to that data source, and I could actually modify key values right here and say that choose a country, that the default text is going to be something else, right? And that will write to the database. And so if I were to deploy this solution and I wanted to make some workflow where users could customize their own labels for things, or maybe I just had a translator application that let a third party easily do my translations for me, but they didn't have to open the IDE or anything. It's not a developer, it's just a translator. You say, here's a list of the translations, do it. You could do something like that. So just wanted to show that you can, it's a real table, you can build stuff against it. Alrighty, that concludes the demo portion. I just want to give you a quick recap. I'll try to go through these quickly just to make sure we summarize what we just saw and take a few questions. So the setup is pretty easy to do. You got to specify that data source on the solution. Once you have that, you can use the I18N Editor, the thing that I showed you with the filter and the reference value and the language value. And you can just add your messages as needed once you establish your keys. And anywhere where you can show text at design time, you can place those keys. Also at runtime, you saw with the API with the calculation and the dialogue example, you can always get the translated value at runtime too, so you can use it in your code. The way it works from a high level is that when the client session starts, the locale is detected, and that includes the language, the country, and the time zone. We didn't really talk about that, but the language, the country, and the time zone are detected, and everything gets translated based on that. Now, you could change the locale at runtime like I did via the API if you wanted to set a preference or something. Also, there is the ability to expose the keys just through the table, through normal found sets and forms and stuff, where end users could work directly with keys and translations. When you create keys and messages, again, a key is a unique identifier, and there could be lots of keys other than your keys. There could be keys coming from modules you've included, or I showed you their system keys for Servoy and Java. So it really helps that you have like a nice namespace convention with something like my company, my module, that sort of thing. Again, the translations are a combination of language and country, and it sort of goes in. It goes in 3 levels of override. There's the reference text, so if you don't provide a translation, that will get used. Then there's the language, so we have, say, English, and that will get used for English, but then you can also override that with language country, so that for English in UK, you could override elevator with lift, because we always fight about what it's called. When you use your keys in your application, all of the components that have a text property, you can do it with a text property editor. We saw value list, the value list editor. We saw how you can set it on column properties themselves. So we saw the title property and the format property, so via the table editor. I think I had something here that was hidden, but I have the, I think it was just saying also dynamically. So you can also get translated values at runtime through the API. One thing that I forgot to show you that's new in 8.2 is you can place, you can create keys on the fly when you're placing a field, and that's really nice. It's in the place field wizard in the advanced example. When you're placing fields, you tick this checkbox and you give it a prefix name. And if you leave that checked, as you add fields and labels, it'll automatically create the I18N key. And because of that prefix thing, it gives you like kind of a smart naming convention, because it gives you the prefix, then the data source, and then the data provider. So actually, some of those keys I generated that way when I first built the example solution. That's a nice thing to leave on, so that if you forget to make keys and you build a form, you don't have to go back and like make the key and then copy and paste those back into the label. We saw how to parameterize keys. So again, you put the little substitution curly braces with the parameter number. Those get replaced when you call I18N get messages from the API and you pass in the actual parameter values. So we saw that on the calculation and the dialog. You can localize formats, so that's for dates, times, numbers, currencies, and also other, any dynamic sort of format that you want to use. It doesn't have to be a language translation. You could just say, for English, I'm going to do this. For something, for French, I'm going to do that. So we did that for dates and our number format. We showed how to set that up, both on the column level, and also you can do it at the field level. And we also did it at the runtime level when I showed that dialog. In development, I18N messages are stored in those text files that I showed you. Those go under revision control. They're in your workspace, and that's what's used when you're working in developer. At deployment, they get written to that table, and so you have to have that data source with that name table there that you set up at the very beginning, and those get populated. You can access the table directly, like I showed you. You can add columns to it. You could filter by tenant or user, so it's a real physical table. And I didn't show this in developer. You can also sync your I18N messages. So in the last example where I showed where in the client I was changing the value, not in the editor, but in the client. If I went back into developer and I'll show you where it is. If I went back into developer and I took my I18N here and I did this right here, read from DB and write to DB. So I could read those keys back out from the DB and overwrite what's changed in the files, so that if I was running some solution and I wanted to, on a development database, and I wanted to import those keys, I could do it that way. So that would have done the update that I did on the database. So that's pretty much it. There are a couple of other edge cases and things to talk about, but I think that's the basics. Sorry we ran a little bit over, but there's a lot of content. As Jan said, we will post a recording to the website and the YouTube channel, and we'll post the example solution and the slides to the forum. Any questions, Jan?
Yes, there's a couple of questions. Actually, I learned a few things as well, Sean, and I thought I knew everything about I18N, but always a couple of things I didn't know. All right, there's a question from Ralph. Can I filter keywords without locale expressions for different languages to find missing ones?
I'm trying to understand what that means. Filter keywords without locale.
Yeah, so let's pretend you're doing two languages and you don't know if you translated everything into German. Can you find the ones that have no translation?
Yes, you can. In the editor, I don't know quite how you would do that, but you have the table there, so you can do all kinds of searches on the table. So one thing that I like to do is make a relation already on the keys that don't have where the language is null, and that gives you all just the key value. So that filters the table down just to the keys, and then you can actually build relations from the key to the translated value. It's a self join on the table, and then you can just toggle between languages and see what your translated values are for each language. And then if you don't have it, you can add it right there through the relation, and it'll fill out all the foreign keys, and you just enter the value. I kind of wanted to show that, but it ran out of time setting this up. But that's one way you could do it. But I don't think you can do it very easily in the editor.
Okay, so the conclusion is write your own SQL or set up a relation and do it in a Servoy form. Question from Thomas. Am I right that I18N keys are automatically stored in the database table?
Yeah, this can be a bit confusing. So when you saw me working with the I18N editor, and if I were to add a new key in that editor, it's only written to that file. It's not written to the database. So in fact, before I ran this demo, I went into that last thing I just showed you where you sync, you right-click I18N and you sync either write to DB or write to file. And so what I did is I basically copied all of my I18N keys into the database so that at runtime I could see what's in the table. But by default, that table will just sit there and do nothing in developer and be empty. It's just important that you have that named data source so that at runtime, it really does fill those, because those files don't exist at deployment time.
All right. There's a question from Anne. How can different time zones be managed in the same country?
Right. Yeah. So I didn't get a chance to show time zones, and the reality is there's not much to show or do. By default, that's an application server setting. It has less to do with I18N, but by default, it uses the client time zone, so the detected time zone on the client's locale, so that when a date time is stored, it's stored with the time zone so that it can be normalized to the client's time zone. So if you're storing one date, and you have a user in the West Coast and a user in the East Coast, they will see that date in their own time zone. Now you can change that server setting to use the server time zone for everything. So it's like if you always want to see dates in the time zone of the application server, generally you don't want to do that. That's only for specific cases. Moreover, you can so you'll always see the dates in your own time zone. If you want to, you can. I showed you how to dynamically change the user's language and country. There's a third option. I could have had a drop-down list of time zones, and you could say, you know what, I want to switch my time zone for this application. You know, let's say I'm traveling abroad, and even though my laptop is still in Eastern US, and now I want to switch it to Central European time, I could do that, and then all of my dates would translate. And as I enter dates too, they would be captured in whatever time zone is set. I hope that answers that.
It does, yes. I hope if Anne has a follow-up question, then please post it before we end. Or if you have questions that pop up after this session, the forum, forum.servoy.com is the right place to go. If we don't have I think there's a main thread open on this tech webinars, right, Jan? Where you post all of this?
Yes, there is. Yeah, and so you can post questions there, and I can post follow-ups.
Excellent. Yes, time zone. So yes, you can detect it, as Jan mentioned. Keep in mind if you're writing code, and I know this from experience in our own CRM system, that I know that when we create invoices in the Netherlands versus in the US, that because it is using your local time zone, in your database there may be a day difference. So make sure that you know what you're doing and that you are programming the way you intended it to work, especially if you're invoicing at the end of a month and those things mean something in your reports. Last question from Imre. What's the best practice to append Locale to the solution URL and then to handle it on the solution and session level? I guess he's talking about sending a deep link to users with a locale in it so that you can then grab that in your application and change the language.
Yeah, if that's what is meant by the question, I mean, deep linking is another topic entirely, but the URL when you launch the solution or at any time while the solution's running can be, you can use parts of the query string to send instructions for when the application's opening, for example. So you could specify in the URL in a deep link that you want a certain locale, language, or country.